Good day, ardent adventurers, I'm Unsilent, and this is Tomb Raider. And this is Tomb Raider. It's Tomb Raider versus Tomb Raider on this episode of Retro Versus. Hello and welcome to Retro Versus, a series in which I take a look at all-time classic games and compare them to modern games in the same franchise or genre. In this episode we go back 25 years. Oh, really, we're going back exactly 25 years to October 25th, 1996. It was this exact day 25 years ago that the first Tomb Raider game was released. For a multitude of reasons that we'll cover during the video, Tomb Raider was an immediate critical and commercial smash hit. The game spawned 14 sequels, 4 spin-offs under the Lara Croft branding, comics, and 3 feature films, 2 of which starred Angelina Jolie. You might make jokes about her now because of all of her adopted children, but an Oscar and Golden Globe winning actress starring in a video game movie after previous massive failures by Hollywood in that genre was actually a big deal at the time. The Tomb Raider franchise is an Indiana Jones-inspired action-adventure game starring the now iconic heroine Lara Croft. Across the series, she travels the world exploring ancient ruins in search of long-lost artifacts. However, Lara's adventures are seldom straightforward treasure hunts, as she often has to battle with the forces of evil, occasionally mythical evil, to save the world. It's a good thing that money isn't her primary motivation, though with the cultural icon status that she reached, it's not like anyone with a stake in the game would have been hurting for cash. In fact, the movies were titled Lara Croft Tomb Raider, because Hollywood saw Lara as bigger than the games. Of course, 1996's Tomb Raider isn't the only game in the franchise which is named Tomb Raider. There's another reasonably well-regarded game called Tomb Raider that we can also talk about. Okay, you were expecting me to cut to a clip of the reboot. We'll get there, but did you know there was a Game Boy Color game called Tomb Raider? It isn't talked about much anymore, but actually isn't a port of 1996's game, but its own story and game. It was even critically well regarded, earning an aggregated review score of 79%, with the likes of IGN and GameSpot scoring the game above that aggregate average. But you aren't here to listen to me talk about the Game Boy Color. We're here to not just look at the original Tomb Raider game, but the reboot as well. While core design originated Tomb Raider, they also nearly ended it. As their time with the franchise drew on, the game slowly became critical cannon fodder. So after the 6th mainline Tomb Raider game, The Angel of Darkness, scored in the 50% range with critics, Eidos Interactive took the franchise away from core and moved it over to Crystal Dynamics. That doesn't get us to 2013 though. They went through a retooling of the franchise for the 3rd trilogy of Tomb Raider games, which started on the game's 10th anniversary with the release of Tomb Raider Legend. After that, Crystal Dynamics took a cue from pop culture and rebooted the franchise, as was the style at the time. The result was a new origin story for Lara. This game was the critically acclaimed Tomb Raider that was released in 2013. Hell, it also got its own Hollywood treatment with a film starring Oscar-winning actress Alicia Vikander. I've not seen that one, but it doesn't seem to have the B-movie fun that the Jolie films had. Given a 17-year gap between the games, technology moved at such a lightning pace that it's hard to compare the two games. After all, the original Tomb Raider was released on 32-bit consoles, the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation 1, while the reboot was on consoles with technical specs that they could only dream of in the 90s. Screens went from 480p with red, yellow, and white connectors on the back and coax cable to 1080p plus with some screens having refresh rates upwards of 120 Hz. There's also the matter of budgets. The original had an estimated budget of under £500,000, roughly under $700,000, while the 2013 game had an estimated budget of around $100 million, or a budget in excess of 140 times the size of the original. Now, if you want a corrected for inflation comparison, co-creator Paul Douglas estimated that inflation and exchange put the original's budget at about $1 million, or about 1% of the reboot's budget. What can I say? I'm an accountant. The financial side of big gaming fascinates me. Anyway, let's start with what I'm comparing. I'm running the PC version of the reboot and the PlayStation 1 version of the original. So we're talking about a console with 32 bits of processing power, pumping out 33 MHz, 2 MB of RAM, 1 MB of video RAM against my PC that is considerably more powerful than that. I mean, 8,000 times the size of video RAM is just the tiniest bit more powerful. Even the minimum specs is 1 GB of video RAM, so there's a big difference in the hardware these games were designed for. Granted, thanks to the power of modern emulation, I can upscale the resolution of the original so it looks a little bit better. It's still not going to win the graphics battle, but it gives you a better idea of what it looked like in the 90s to gamers at the time. After all, the best PS1 games back in the 90s looked like the best PS5 games do to gamers today. A mind-blowing PS1 game running at native resolution looks ancient by modern standards, but it was amazing back then. And this is where art style matters. An older game with a well-done art style can age gracefully. Just look at all the gorgeous 8 and 16-bit style games that modern indie developers are still making to this day. Both Tomb Raider games in question went for a realistic aesthetic to the graphics. It works for the time, but those are the sorts of games that don't age well as technology pushes the definition of realistic graphics. What looks realistic in 1996 is nothing compared to 2013. And go another 17 years out from that to 2030 and games may look almost indistinguishable from real life. And yes, only 8 years out from the rebooted Tomb Raider, that game does look a little dated if you aren't maxing out the graphics on PC, so we're already starting to see the game's visuals age. Thanks to modern emulation, you can find yourself in a situation where you're debating between the less of two proverbial evils. You could run the game at the original resolution, but everything will look pixelated, blurry, and muddy, or you could upscale the visuals so some of the game might look better, but other parts may actually be better off at the original 640 by 480. That was a long way of saying that the original doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't look good either. It just hasn't aged well. Lara actually looks okay. Sure, her character model doesn't live up to what they pulled off in the modern Tomb Raider games, but it's not nightmare-inducing either. While the environments hold up, the enemies tend not to. Looking at some of the myriad wild homicidal animals and humans that you run into along the way, you can clearly see the joints where the various body parts connect. The build of the character models is probably great for animating them, but doesn't really work if you're thinking about how these people and creatures are supposed to be realistically built. I could also make a crack about how literally blocky some of these folks are built, but that would probably be a bit unfair given the age of the game. Although, despite the comparatively poor graphics, there's a slight irony that the Tomb Raider franchise's most iconic visuals are from the original. It's 1996's Lara Croft that is the cultural icon and the gaming mascot, not the rebooted Lara Croft. Similarly, the T-Rex fight from the original game is well known to gamers of the time and was a big part of the game's marketing material to boot. The reboot lacks those iconic moments as well, unless Lara being basically maimed and tortured counts as memorable throughout gaming, for all the wrong reasons. Speaking of animations, let's talk about them for a minute. I probably don't have to hammer away at this point because it's in the video title and mentioned right off the top, but the original Tomb Raider is 25 years old. It's running on hardware and using programming that's older than Tomb Raider's October 25th, 1996 release date, but let's use that quarter-century mark for argument's sake. It's not just the visuals that have been upgraded over time, but how they're animating everything. One big change in the gaming industry between the original game and the reboot was the increased usage of motion capture technology. While not everything in the reboot was motion captured, a good portion of the cutscene performances were motion captured and then translated into the game. It's not an uncommon practice with most AAA titles using some form of motion and or facial capture technology to bring more realism to the screen. To get games more realistic, they use actual performances as the basis for the in-game performances. They also use actual people as the model for the in-game people. It's a massive overhaul from all of the classic games where it was the developers who did the heavy lifting on animation, rather than motion capture teams. The advantage of motion capture is that you get realistic movements and actions from the characters. The disadvantage is that you don't get all the cool moves that you could just create by hand. After all, Who can motion capture a handstand while pulling yourself up from dangling on a ledge? Who can jump at a wall and spring off it? Who can do a dodge roll and comes up guns a-blazing? It's little things that we had in the 90s that the 2010s don't provide. When you're doing all of the movement and animation from scratch, it opens up the player character to a lot of things that a real person can't do. We'll dive into the story of the games in a moment, but the audio of the games is much more important in the reboot than the original. With a greater emphasis on the narrative in the newer Tomb Raider, there are more characters who need a voice and more lines that they are given compared to the relatively sparse story interludes of the classic Tomb Raider. Not only does 2013's game put a greater emphasis in bringing the story to life, but the whole industry has as well. Making a well-written, well-acted story has become a staple of AAA gaming. So while games in the 90s wouldn't always get the best actors, games now splurge on actual professional actors. Sometimes they hire them for talent, and sometimes just for name recognition. Fortunately, the former is the case here. Even the voice acting in the original isn't diabolically bad. Having gone through a couple of classic games with voice acting, the original's acting holds up well compared to, say, Resident Evil.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
From a music side, it becomes a double-edged sword. Most of the music in the reboot can be classified as quiet ambiance. Like a lot of modern AAA games, except for very, very few moments, the music just hums along in the background without you noticing it. Other than the Tomb Raider theme, which originates in 1996, I probably couldn't remember one piece of music from the reboot. Not that it's a problem isolated to Crystal Dynamics' direction of the reboot. That's just all AAA games. They allegedly have a great soundtrack, but most of it is so quiet that you never hear it over the sounds and voices of the game, and so forgettable that you'd never be able to hum it back even if you did hear it. Seriously, digging up the background music for this video is the first that I've heard most of this music. So while the reboot has a much more extensive soundtrack, the original has a shorter soundtrack that is ingrained in my head. That's probably because the sound mixing in the original game is so different than the reboot. Because there isn't a lot of ambient music in the classic Tomb Raider, the big moments in action are emphasized by big, loud, bombastic scores that don't have to be kept quiet, so you can hear pointless banter and ambient noise during the combat and exploration. So while there's a smaller soundtrack, what's there hits home harder and louder. In going through comparing the audio and visuals of these two games, the conclusion I'm left with isn't really which game looks and sounds better than the other. Rather, I find that we'll be having a recurring theme in this comparison that these two games are very much products of their time, and the differences between the games show not just the evolution of technology, but the evolution of gaming from a very much gameplay-focused experience to something trying to be more similar to movies and premium TV. In other words, gaming shifting the focus in search of the cinematic gaming experience. As such, not only have the graphics and audio improved significantly over the 25 years since Tomb Raider was released, but the presentation style has changed to something wanting to integrate storytelling as a primary pillar of the game in order to take advantage of those advances in audio and visual fidelity. With the narrative becoming an increasingly important component of the gaming experience, it shouldn't surprise anyone to see that the two games take two very different approaches to storytelling. Tomb Raider 1996 is pretty much a straightforward approach to the story. It was an Indiana Jones-inspired story with an intrepid badass archaeologist on a whirlwind world tour in search of not only treasure and ancient artifacts, but to also stop the forces of evil from acquiring said artifacts to use for their own nefarious purposes. It's like an action movie as a video game. Pretty standard today, but a bit of a novelty at that time. It's also worth mentioning that the stories largely contain two cutscenes that play before and after the levels. So while the story isn't the main focus of the game, it is what drives us from level to level. That said, core design was more focused on the pieces of the game that came between those cutscenes. The rebooted Tomb Raider puts a larger emphasis on the story. Now there are a multitude of reasons for this. There's an expectation that story will play a larger role in modern games than just being in the manual or a couple of story interludes. The original game had to cram everything onto a CD, while Blu-ray discs and direct downloads don't have the same storage restrictions when it comes to programming and recording the audio and video necessary to have those story segments. Technology has also evolved so the game can seamlessly integrate the story with the gameplay and instantly switch from player-controlled action to a story segment rather than having to isolate the story to pre-rendered scenes noticeably separate of the gameplay. The reboot focuses primarily on Lara. This is Lara's journey. Rebooting the franchise allowed Crystal Dynamics an opportunity to reboot Lara and start her from scratch. When we meet Lara in the original, she's already a wealthy, successful treasure hunter whose services are in demand, though she's more interested in the chase of the next great treasure than the growing fame and fortune she has already amassed. However, with focus groups showing an increased disdain for the classic Croft character, Lara underwent a complete retooling for the reboot. The new Lara starts out as a recent university graduate, not so much looking to make a name for herself, but more interested in validating the work of her father. However, as a very green, barely an adventurer, let alone an explorer textbook studier, rather than a gun-toting, ruin-raiding, self-sufficient badass, the devs were able to craft Lara as a very different character to Core Design's original heroine, and therefore focus on Lara's growth. That's really the goal of the story. While both Tomb Raiders really have their adventure happening in the background, the original happens in the background of the gameplay, while the reboot has the story happen in the background of the focus on Lara. Every element of danger and loss is in place only really to serve the goal of developing Lara as a character. I don't say that as a bad thing. That was the goal of the game's story. Establish Lara as a fresh iteration of the iconic character and start to develop her back towards the heroic character that we all knew from the previous games, but a little more grounded and human, rather than superhero-like as she was portrayed in earlier games. So I could talk about Lara and friends being shipwrecked and trapped on the island of Yamatai by a supernatural force while battling a mad cult worshipping a goddess who controls the weather, but it's all secondary to Lara's journey. Really, if I could succinctly sum up the difference between the game's stories, the original focused on the plot, such as it was, while the reboot emphasized the characters. I'd say they were both reasonably successful in what they set out to do. Wait, did I only say reasonably successful? Well, it's time to bust out 2013's favorite gaming journalism buzzword. It's ludonarrative dissonance. If you forgot about ludonarrative dissonance, a winner is you. The origin of the term comes back to the aftermath of the initial wave of hype sales and perfect or near-perfect review scores for BioShock Infinite. The so-called gaming media did some en masse critiquing of the game that the game and the story didn't marry up, hence coining of the term ludonarrative dissonance. Ludo meaning game, narrative for story, and dissonance for another big word. Ignoring groupthink and the Game Journal Pros group that was revealed a couple years later, I found it interesting that Tomb Raider wasn't criticized as prominently for the same issue, despite being released in the same month as BioShock Infinite. So why do I think ludonarrative dissonance exists in Tomb Raider? Well, it's because Lara in story cutscenes and Lara when controlled by the player act as though they are two very different characters. There are various moments in the game that are played as significant milestones in Lara's journey. For example, she has to kill a deer for food to survive and kill various enemies to live. These moments shake Lara to her very core. While she was trained to handle a bow and a gun, she saw it as overprotective lessons from mentor figures rather than a tool of her trade. She was moved to tears and nearly emotionally broken by having to kill an innocent animal and having to take another human's life, even if it was to save her own. We then exit those cutscenes, and Lara's a homicidal maniac. You see, while Lara the character, Lara the narrative construct, would rather never kill at the start of her journey, and is even reluctant to do so for a large portion of the game, Lara the player avatar is not reluctant to kill the forces that threaten her, or the forces that mildly inconvenience her, or even the ones that are just unlucky enough to cross her path. As soon as the first kills are completed, Lara is allowed to be armed and dangerous. There is nothing stopping her from hunting down every animal on Yamatai and killing them mostly for sport. I mean, after the first deer is killed, there's no real benefit to the player other than generic crafting material and achievements. And Lara's kills get more and more violent as the game progresses, as she's able to attack enemies with her climbing tools and even violently execute them with her weapons. Visually stunning effect, ludologically satisfying to see Lara fight for herself, but narratively questionable character development. Sure, you may argue she starts out as not quite a pacifist, but definitely not a warrior. She ends the game ready to murder anyone and anything in her path to save she and her friends. That's fair, but that's also not what I'm talking about. Killing animals and humans for the first time didn't start a gradual change, but it was more of a light switch moment. It's not that the kills got progressively easier for Lara. It's that the first kill opened the floodgates, so by the end of the game, Lara is mowing down swaths of enemies with a machine gun and shouting one-liners like a damn sociopath. In a movie, an actor can convey that change. They, along with the rest of the crew, can show that character growth or that change from being overwhelmed to steely resolve. That's not something that is easily shown when the game spends most of its time with the camera pointed at Lara's ass. The rest of the devs played Uncharted. The camera guys played Mass Effect 2. Anyway, so when people talk about ludonarrative dissonance, I don't mean it in the sense that a lot of other people have misappropriated this buzzword. It's not the seemingly commonly used meaning of a lot of talking followed by a lot of shooting. I'm talking about a clear difference in the same character's behavior between narrative and gameplay segments of the game. That is what we have here with Lara. That said, if story is what you crave in a game, you're going to favor the new Tomb Raider over the classic for the reasons mentioned earlier. With story getting an ever greater emphasis in gaming, it shouldn't be a surprise that story is a strong pillar which supports the 2013 game. That's not something I could say about the 1996 Tomb Raider, in which the story is just a bridge to get us between locations and levels. It's a serviceable story, yes, but it's not the heart of the game as it was with the reboot. While the two games obviously differ greatly in the presentation and the importance of their stories, I feel the dichotomy in their game lies mostly in the game itself. Okay, everyone has parts of the whole that they put a greater emphasis on, but a video game isn't a video game without that interactive element. You know, the game part of video game. However, while one game had a unique take on firearm combat when it was released, the other was dangerously close to a carbon copy of a popular franchise at the time. So let's take a look at some of the inspirations for both games then. In doing some research on The Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, I came across this mention that the original Tomb Raider took some inspiration from the original Prince of Persia. There's an emphasis on freedom of movement, responsive combat, and smooth animations in Tomb Raider 1996. So Core Design took a 2D inspiration and used the strong points of that game to inform how they built their 3D game. Yes, they added onto it, but you can see their fandom for Prince of Persia coming through in the platforming. The leaping, the grabbing ledges, Lara pulling herself up, all the similar styling from Prince of Persia is here in Tomb Raider. Coincidentally, what Core did in Tomb Raider also went back and inspired work on Prince of Persia 3D. They don't talk about that game very much now, though. The gunplay is a lot more run and gun, though. It feels more id-inspired than Mechner-inspired, which is reflected in the pace of the action. Since this isn't a cover-based shooter, not that such things really existed in the modern definition of that genre in the 90s, Lara is constantly on the move. It reminds me a bit of both Doom and Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, the latter because of the acrobatic tricks that both Lara and the prince can execute during combat, the former because movement is a critical survival skill. You can't stand and trade blows with the enemies or you'll be mauled or eaten or otherwise massacred. Unlike those two aforementioned games, Lara's offense is controlled via an auto-aim function. While it's not a terrible function most of the time, the game can get you in a sticky situation if it doesn't auto-target the way you want. There is an override where if you're aiming at a desired enemy, you can lock on by holding the action button, which is X on the PlayStation. However, hold is the operative word there. so you have to hold the action button while simultaneously jumping and rolling. Sure, you could keep blasting at your desired target while it's off screen, but now you've tied up a thumb, so maximizing movement, which is key to survival in Tomb Raider, is made quite difficult because of the dance that you have to do with your hands to keep your thumb on X while pivoting around between square and circle as needed. The interesting part of the movement is that the pace of Lara's movement and the responsiveness of the controls feels like it changes whether or not her guns are out. Firearms, mine's out of the gutter. But it does feel like Lara is more responsive to inputs once she's armed, as opposed to a slower response and movement when unarmed. While the difference can feel a little off-putting in the moment, it makes sense. Lara needs to move and respond with a sense of urgency when in imminent danger. If only she could move more that way when in danger from traps or try to make death-defying leaps as well. Not helping matters is the game's use of what I've heard referred to as tank controls. Nowadays, we're used to a D-pad or keyboard or thumbstick moving a character when we move it in that direction. The original Tomb Raider uses a more classic shooter-inspired control scheme. Rather than run you to the left or the right, those buttons on the D-pad turn you. Want to go to the right? Slowly spin to the right and push forward. In motion, it's not bad. Sure, Lara won't be taking anyone to Juke City with that movement, but it's functionally realistic if you're not trying to break your ankles with quick movement. This is why when you watch gameplay of Tomb Raider, you'll see a lot of jumping and rolling in combat. The best way to quickly move is through Lara's more acrobatic moves. She may be a bit of a tank on the ground, but she floats like a butterfly when airborne. Again, the difference in how you control Lara in and out of combat is a little off-putting, but it's not unmanageable to adapt to both. It does take a while to adapt to the required or optimal movement in and out of combat, though. As alluded to previously, the gameplay of the reboot is very similar to that of a similarly themed franchise that had stolen the hearts of gamers and critics alike while the Tomb Raider franchise was being reworked after Underworld. The Uncharted franchise launched in 2007, helmed by Sony mainstay developer Naughty Dog. While it obviously had some inspiration from the Tomb Raider franchise, it took a different spin on movement and combat. The games had an Indiana Jones feel to them, comparisons that core design seemed to shy away from early in the development of the original game. So when people talk about games with a cinematic feel to them, Uncharted is definitely one of those games to point people towards. So if Uncharted drew so many comparisons to the Tomb Raider franchise that it was jokingly referred to as Dude Raider when first revealed, what joking name would one give to Tomb Raider? The core gameplay loop is incredibly similar. In the final hours of Tomb Raider, creative director Noah Hughes is quoted as saying, quote, "We were sick of being beaten by the competition," end quote. I guess the next part of the quote that was left out was something along the lines of, "If you can't beat them, join them." While the devs wanted to move away from the classic style of combat that was synonymous with the franchise to gamers, they went to a style of combat that was already pretty ubiquitous in gaming by the time that 2013's game was released. Similar to Uncharted, the gun combat was third-person and cover-based, with fairly obvious areas where a gun battle was about to take place. The player no longer had a health bar, but health was automatically regenerated after a period of time not taking damage. There are little trinkets to find for achievements, and areas where the player can and should jump and climb are very well indicated, and the animations indicating which direction you're about to jump are about the same. Well, the template for that style of platforming was set back in Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, really. There are slight differences from Uncharted, though. There's a rock climbing axe that Lara could use as a weapon and to move around. Stealth played a greater emphasis than in the early Uncharted games. The cover is destructible to keep you on the move. None of these are bad changes, and I quite like them. However, even with Crystal Dynamics putting their own little twists here and there, I still can't help feel that I'm playing a reskinned Uncharted mod rather than a game with its own identity. On the plus side, Uncharted was at or near the top of the gaming world when Tomb Raider was being developed, so at least they copied the right game. On the downside of the changes from the original and the inspiration is the vast quantities of QuickTime events. There are many moments peppered throughout the game in which the player will have to push or mash a button to execute a specific action that wouldn't otherwise be possible with normal controls. It's cool once or twice, but it takes you out of the moment when you know rather than watching the scene play out in front of you, You have to be watching for an indicator to tell you what button to push or when to push a button so Lara doesn't die a painful death. There's also a significant design problem with going to a cover-based third-person shooter as the basis for the game. The nature of cover-based games is that they very often telegraph when combat is going to occur because the area you're in is filled with chest-high walls for you to duck behind. So there was no surprise when you turn a corner and suddenly it's combat time. At least with the original, you had to be on your toes because you never quite knew when the game was going to throw some enemies your way. One other major change from the original game is the introduction of RPG-inspired upgrading, as was and still is the style at the time. Killing enemies, raiding tombs, and completing objectives gives you experience points to unlock new abilities for Lara to use while scrounging, platforming, or killing. Also around the island of Yamatai are crates and enemies that can be looted for generic crafting material called gear, which can be used to upgrade Lara's weapons. It's a very RPG-light pair of elements, and you might have even been able to go through the game without upgrades or just minimal upgrades to Lara and her arsenal, but it's an add-on the completionists will appreciate. The puzzle segments of the reboot were largely confined to the tombs that you could happen across in exploring the island. Each of these so-called secret tombs had a different puzzle hook that you had to work out in order to reach the treasure that you never actually see at the top of the tomb. Yes, the end results of tomb explorations aren't spectacular. It's the same opening a treasure chest scene and XP bonus every time. The excitement is basically contained to seeing if you unlock a weapon part to upgrade your arsenal, though not all tombs will have that bonus. The puzzles are kind of neat, though, and play on some of the elemental themes that you see during the game, such as wind, water, and fire. Similar to the RPG elements, you can go through the game with minimal interaction with the secret tombs. They'll help you progress more easily, and it gives something for completionists to pad the time with. However, similar to the RPG elements, other than one or two forced interactions with this gameplay element, you can cruise through the game without ever completing a puzzle. While the tombs are in Tomb Raider, you don't really have to do any raiding in Tomb Raider. Maybe they should have just called the game Lara Croft instead of Tomb Raider. However, there are puzzles that you need to go through in order to complete 1996's Tomb Raider. Given that this game came more or less on the heels of the pinnacle of adventure games, you might be rightly concerned that Core might have designed some of these puzzles to be reminiscent of the occasionally obtuse adventure game variety. Lord knows some of those puzzles in the Monkey Island series befuddled me. You just didn't realize because I adeptly edited around the frustration. Anyway, the puzzles in Tomb Raider generally aren't too bad. There's a bit of searching and backtracking required, but nothing that ever requires massive logical leaps leaving you lost. So the reboot and the original are similar in this regard. The puzzles are there, but they aren't challenging enough that they will impede your progress in the game. They're a nice break from the rest of the running and jumping and gunning that makes up the majority of the game. Core design and crystal dynamics are similar in that they used puzzles as a palate cleanser, rather than making it a critical component of the game. There's nothing wrong with that. If you really wanted a puzzle game, it's not like there were a shortage of either of those in 1996 or 2013. There's even a Tomb Raider puzzle game on mobile if you really want to play it. When talking about the gameplay, I really can't shake the same feeling that I've had for the last 8 years. Playing the rebooted Tomb Raider just makes me think that I've played this game before, and a version of it that I enjoyed more when I played Uncharted. While I can appreciate that Tomb Raider may have inspired some of what we received in Uncharted, I can't help but feel that the new Tomb Raider plays far too similarly to Uncharted to feel like its own game. Even if it had all these various enhancements that nearly 2 decades affords developers and gamers, there's a clinical feeling to the reboot. If it wasn't for the inclusion of Lara Croft, it would feel like any focus-grouped paint-by-the-numbers major industrial project of that PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 console generation. There's a rawness to the original game. Sure, they don't quite have everything running smoothly in the original, but that's part of its charm. The camera isn't great, I'm seldom sure what I'm aiming at, precise movement is almost non-existent. It's clear that the 1996 game is all part of the learning process. Does that mean it should get a break? It's all about hindsight. The last 25 years have seen developers find ways to iron out the wrinkles that were still relatively new to the gaming industry as a whole back then. While we look at some elements as rough today, they were relatively glossed over back in the day because they were new and bordering on revolutionary. It's interesting how much has changed over the 17 years between the original and the reboot. The classic Tomb Raider had to chart its own direction with gameplay and took inspiration from a variety of sources. The reboot really comes off as a remake of Uncharted. Sure, they threw in a few new elements in the game, but they're half-hearted and tangential to the whole experience to the point where you'd be forgiven if you forgot those elements were there. The problem with calling a series Retro Versus is that it pits two games against each other in something akin to a battle, but it really isn't. It's a live-fire demonstration of how gaming has evolved over 2 decades in this instance. Of course, one game will be better than the other to the point of it being nearly an objective fact. It's a near-objective fact that the rebooted Tomb Raider outperforms the classic in just about every way. That's not a bad thing. That's just the nature of the evolution of technology and the evolution of gaming along with it. But when you take the game's individual components, your evaluation is one thing. When you put it all together and put it in its historical context, it's quite different. After all, it was the original game that innovated in gameplay design and created an iconic character. The reboot was really heavily inspired by the gameplay and presentation of the Uncharted franchise, with some occasionally uncomfortably sadistic tendencies on top. If you're going to completely restart the lore of the franchise, I don't have an issue with also completely restarting work on the gameplay loop of the game as well. The problem is they didn't do anything new. Innovated a little, yes, but not to an extent enough that it didn't have a big feeling of, been there, done that. And so we come back to the problem that I'm wrestling with. In almost no objective way is the original Tomb Raider better than the reboot. Objectively, the reboot has better graphics, better characters, better acting, better controls, you name it, and 2013's game does it better, but that's almost a given with the game running on 17-year newer hardware and using 17 years of lessons about how to make games better. Subjectively, I come back to what the reboot's creative director said. They're sick of being beaten by the competition, and they were most definitely beaten by the competition. The recurring theme of this episode of Retro Versus is the objective versus the subjective. And while one game might be objectively better, subjectively, it really falls behind its predecessor. After all, one of these games was a pop culture phenomenon that created a gaming mascot, it innovated gameplay, it inspired other games, and spawned a franchise that has lasted a quarter century. The other borrowed heavily from other games. It spawned a movie that did worse than its predecessor before and after factoring in inflation, and it started a trilogy that seems to have put the franchise apparently back on ice. It's hard not to take history and impact as a big factor in evaluating these games, but I can't help but feel that it does play a huge part in the overall Tomb Raider story. If the Tomb Raider franchise launched in 2013 with this reboot, would it be considered anything but an Uncharted knockoff? Whether it was the first or most recent time playing it, I kept coming back to that comparison. That's not a problem anyone has had with the original game. It may not have stood the test of time, but looking at the Tomb Raider Anniversary remake, it shows that there is a strong base to this game that can be brought up to modern standards without losing the soul of the original. And it's the soul, it's the subjective, that keeps favoring the original. The soul, the subjective of the original is there. The reboot does feel a bit clinical, does feel a bit focus grouped. It lacks the soul of the original. And that's why my pick is the original, the first, the classic 1996's Tomb Raider. And that will do it for this episode of Retro Versus. Do you agree or disagree with my choice? Leave a comment down below with which game you would pick as the top of the Tomb Raiders. Bonus points for picking the Game Boy game. And while you're on your way to the comment section, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new or looking for more retro gaming greatness, share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent on air, and that is for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And don't forget, there are many more looks at the great and not so great in retro gaming in the playlists. They're on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.